Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual WHA side event on access to medicines in pandemics. My name is Ella Weggen, and I'm a global health advocate at Wemos, a global health foundation based in the Netherlands. I'm working in the Access to Medicines team. Welcome to all participants and the panelists. Over 220 people registered, so that's great. This event is organized on behalf of several public health organizations, KEI, Medicines Law and Policy, Haki, Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, Health Action International, Cooperación Innovarte, and Wemos. We're very honored to gather a high-level panel with keynote speakers at such a crucial moment. As we all know, the World Health Assembly is taking place as of next week, when all 194 WHO member states will take a decision on a pandemic accord. Negotiations are still taking place as we speak. Additional sessions have been scheduled this week. We're looking forward today to hearing more on the insights from negotiators and civil society organizations' perspectives on the process, the final stages of the discussions, and what the outcome will or should be. Wemos has been following the developments around the pandemic accord over the last 2 years. There has been some progress on provisions proposed on transparency, on equitable distribution and scaling up of this distribution, and there have been some more sticky points around equity, the transfer of technology and know-how, IP sharing, financing, and health workforce. The most important is that at the end of the road, the process results in a pandemic accord that delivers improvement on equity when compared with the status quo, and does not only impose obligations and burdens, particularly on low and middle income countries. The pandemic accord could provide a solid basis for further discussions and agreements, and it will help to build a safer world capable of coping with future pandemics and providing faster and fairer access to medical products. We have a full program today, and hopefully we can start with some interesting speakers. We have invited IMB co-chair, Precious Matsoso. I'm not sure if she's in the room already. I don't see her. But then we will start with the country representatives from the Philippines, the USA, the Netherlands, and Colombia. That will be followed by a response of civil society organizations from KEI, Medicines Law and Policy, and Innovarte. There are some house rules. This event will be recorded, and the recording will be shared afterwards. We will try to keep the event short, but if needed, we might take 1.5 hours. After all the panel members spoke, we will open a broader Q&A session with all online participants. People can ask questions in the chat. We will try to address them, but only if time allows. Please add the name of the panelist ahead of your question if it's addressed to a specific speaker. So now I would like to open the floor to Mr. Jeff Valdez from the Philippines. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone participating in this webinar. Just to start with a brief introduction for myself. My name is Jeff Valdez. I am working at the Philippine Mission here in Geneva. I am a career foreign service officer. I'm not a public health professional. I'm no expert in transfer of technology, PABs. What I am is a negotiator. And this is the reason why, one of the reasons why I was brought to Geneva is to help with pandemic treaty negotiations. So just to share with you the Philippines' outlook and priorities in the negotiations to start. So the Philippines is a developing member state, and we have a very large population. We are now 113 million Filipinos in the Philippines, and at least another 11 million Filipinos abroad. By most measures, we are a middle-income country, but we are decidedly a developing member state in our priorities in the INB and the pandemic agreement negotiations. Because of this, we are a founding member of the Group for Equity, which is now composed of more than 30 developing member states. The Philippines had the privilege of making the first joint statement on behalf of the Group for Equity in June 2023 during the 5th session of the INB. And our objective really in helping form the group is to create a platform for the common interests of developing member states, and also to help build consensus to make it easier for our negotiating partners to interact and engage with our positions. Because of the Philippines' unique situation, we are able to be flexible on many issues in the pandemic agreement. For instance, we see the articles on enhanced obligations on surveillance, for example, Articles 4, 5, and 6, as a way for us to help legislate resources that would enable us to implement these enhanced obligations. At the same time, we have very, very strong support for the other articles that seek to concretize the concept of equity, which I believe is more the topic for today's discussion. This includes, of course, Article 12 on the pathogen access and benefit sharing system, Articles 10, 11, and 13 on sustainable and geographically distributed production, transfer of technology, and logistics and supply chains. We are also a major proponent of Article 7 on the health and care workforce, which is very important for us, being a major source of health professionals for practically the whole world. So this is how we approach the negotiations. And this is very much influenced by our experience during COVID-19. Obviously, there is very strong recency effect for all delegations to the INB. And just to share with you our experience, especially with regards to countermeasures during COVID-19. If you look at the initiatives for equitable access or enhanced access to countermeasures, the Philippines donated a very modest amount to COVAX. We donated $1.1 million to COVAX. And for a bunch of different reasons, the Philippines ended up receiving almost 90 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines through the COVAX facility. Many of these vaccine donations came from our bilateral partners, the United States being one of them, many EU member states, and others. And we note that this is not the same experience across the board for many developing member states. Being a middle-income developing member states, the Philippines obviously welcomed support in terms of access to countermeasures during COVID-19. At the same time, we had just the right amount of health systems infrastructure and capacity to utilize these countermeasures, that we ended up receiving a lot more than what we expected. And this was all in addition to the procurement that we did for ourselves, accounting for everyone in our target population. So ultimately, the Philippines ended up also donating vaccines to other countries. We know that this is a function of a member state's ability to distribute and utilize vaccines. And during COVID-19, we noticed that there were certain countries that are attracting this level of support, but there are also a lot of countries that suffered from a lack of attention in terms of access to countermeasures. There are various references suggesting that to this day, less than 50% of the African continent's target population is vaccinated for COVID-19. So because of this observation and our own experience, we decided to really support the most of the developing member states' positions in terms of concretizing equity, especially in the articles that relate to access to countermeasures. And you can divide these articles into two. One is basically Article 12, right? The Pathogen Access Benefit Sharing System, which is the most direct form of enhancing equitable access to countermeasures. The deal on the table has always been an obligation to share pathogens with pandemic potential in exchange for a set-aside. Now, the set-aside is inspired by the PIP framework. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, has always been 20%. 10% in the form of a donation, 10% in the form of at cost or low cost sales to be
1 more minute, please.
Sorry, I'll wrap up very soon. To be distributed by WHO. The other articles are less direct in how they would influence equitable access to countermeasures. And I'm speaking of Article 11 on tech transfer, Article 10 on production, Article 13 on the logistics network, and even Article 20 on financing. All these other articles have a very important role in expanding access to countermeasures, although in a lot less direct fashion compared to pathogen access and benefit sharing system. I'd just like to end with our prognosis of where we are and where we're headed. The Philippines really believes that we are close to achieving consensus. But the most important thing is whatever happens at the end of this week and at the World Health Assembly is that member states build enough momentum to not just stop and give up in the event that we don't finish. So our instructions from Capital is to facilitate the building of consensus and to ensure that whatever happens leading up to the assembly is that we will be part of a commitment and a plan to move forward and to continue working with other member states to take this text home and have an effective and functioning pandemic agreement. Thank you for now, and I appreciate your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, from the Philippines. It's great to have your contribution. We will move on now to the next speaker. She's from the United States of America, Ms. Emily Bleimund. Please give the floor to you. for a statement on access to medicines and pandemic prevention. Oh, you're still on mute?
I'm here. Hello.
Yes. Hi.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation to speak today and for everybody's interest in this topic. We are in the final rounds, as you all know, and I'm missing the negotiations this week. I'm in DC working on taking care of the DC side, but have been actively involved. And just want to say first that I'm going to speak today on my personal capacity, not officially as a representative of the US, but also from my experience as being a co-facilitator with Jeff for several of the articles in the agreement, namely Articles 10, 11, and 13 on supply chain, production, tech transfer, procurement. So anyway, thanks again. Even though I'm speaking my personal capacity, I mean, I can confirm, obviously the United States is very committed to this process. We are seeking a consensus-based outcome. We are eagerly engaged and, looking forward to wrapping this up and having an agreement. And something that we can, take forward and that, lots of great work can actually come after as well. And I think that our positions are, really based, as Jeff was saying, on sort of the experience looking back at COVID and what happened. And it's been really helpful to have been through that experience so recently and be drawing on examples from what happened to sort of, come up with what we think are the best solutions to include in the pandemic accord. To try to problem solve, right, for things that we all acknowledge didn't go as well as they should have. I think that one of our principles in this negotiation, though, is to make sure that we don't break or otherwise, cause problems with things that we did see as working well, right? So we saw a lot of things that worked well during COVID, including sort of the amazing speed with which we had innovation in this space and how we got these really effective and successful vaccines. The question then, right, is getting access to those vaccines, but the innovation and the regulatory processes and all of that worked really well at the beginning, at least. And so we want to make sure that we preserve that because we can't have access to something that doesn't exist. And so that's really important, as well as, sharing information, science, samples, all those things. We need to get that information out there so that we can have these great innovations. Then the challenge becomes, how do we get those innovations to everyone? I also forgot, I skipped the part that Jeff remembered to do at the beginning, just to say that I've been at the US Department of Health and Human Services in the Office of Global Affairs for more than a decade now, working on trade issues and access to medicines issues pretty much that entire time. And before that, I'm a lawyer by training. I was in private practice. I was at FDA and I was also at an NGO. So I've sort of seen a lot of these issues from multiple perspectives, which has been really great. So anyway, going to sort of lessons from COVID that I think people are trying to reflect on and solve for in this agreement. I mean, obviously lots of delays in access. I think you can point to a number of reasons why that happened. We didn't have enough production. That's very, very clear. We didn't have enough diversified production. We had production happening in certain places. And when those places decided that they needed that product, there wasn't a lot of other options for the COVAX facility, for example, and others. We saw, some issues with procurement, the way things are being procured, lack of financing, of course, lack of readiness in some countries' systems. So having regulatory systems ready and in place to receive these products and to approve them, lack of readiness to deal with issues like liability, risk management, workforce issues, distribution issues, and then of course, hesitancy and misinformation. And I'm sure I've forgotten a number of key other barriers and delays as well. But, kind of taking a step back and looking at all that, what causes lack of access? We're trying to figure out, okay, in this agreement, how can we commit governments, because those are the parties to the agreement. We can't really, we can't promise that other actors will do things, but we as governments can commit ourselves to taking certain actions and doing things differently. I know Jeff mentioned PABs. That's a big one. That is not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to say a whole lot on it, except to say that it's quite complicated. As you know, we're not going to be deciding the details of that at this time, because in fact, it is so complicated. And in fact, my coworkers are in negotiations on PABs as we speak in Geneva. So, so that one, but that is a critical component for many countries, of course. But we have these other articles, as Jeff was talking about, that I think we've really worked hard and countries are really committed to taking some action in these areas. So on production, for example, we're working on commitments around facilitating and incentivizing voluntary tech transfer, licensing, geographic diversification, capacity building, and also creating mechanisms to do technology transfer. So, we have a lot of great text around these ideas and these concepts. And I think everybody is, on the same page in terms of understanding and committing that more needs to be done in that space. By governments, we can't just expect the private sector to stand up and do the right thing all the time. I think that governments have a role to play, and we need to be very thoughtful about how we can incentivize this kind of thing and make sure that it is happening more than it was during COVID, even though it did happen, but we would like to see more of it. Another thing that we've seen a lot of interest in is this concept around transparency. Thinking back about my work during COVID, I remember so many conversations where we said, gosh, if only we knew, right? If only we knew who had bought this vaccine and when it was being delivered, if only we knew, where things were being made and what was happening with the supply chain. And, we've heard this from WHO as well. This is an extreme handicap when you don't have information. How are you as a public health decision maker supposed to do the right thing if you don't have the information? So this is something that a lot of countries are interested in, this idea of, publication, making publicly available the terms of your procurement agreements during a pandemic, what you're buying, who you're buying from, when it's being delivered, so that WHO and other governments can just sort of see the bigger picture of what's happening and can make better choices. Also publishing things like your processes. How do you make your regulatory decisions? What are they based on? A little bit of information about how you made those decisions is also something very important. Publishing your licensing agreements. Who are you licensing with? What are the terms? So that's been a big push as well. And I think that's also something that is very important to the US and to a lot of other countries. We have these issues around readiness, as I mentioned, regulatory readiness, big one, right? We have a whole article on that, which I think is fantastic. And I think in general, that's been something that most countries are very supportive of. And some of the main principles there are, having an expedited review system for these types of situations. And if you don't have the capacity to do that yourself, there's this precedent for doing something called regulatory reliance, where you can actually, do a basic review of the dossier, but you can, in the most part, rely on another regulatory authority or on WHO's analysis to make your decision. It speeds things up incredibly. We saw it during COVID. We saw a lot of countries using reliance, but some of them weren't really prepared for that. They didn't have it written into their system and their laws, and they had to change their frameworks or adopt an emergency declaration. And so the idea is, let's prepare for this in advance. Let's have these laws in place. Let's have these processes ready so that when you need to pull the trigger, you can, and it's easy and it's quick. And another issue related to this is liability, which is a challenging issue, because I think some people interpret this as, giving something else to industry or protecting industry. But in fact, what we saw during COVID is, governments asking industry to, go through an expedited process to develop a product and test it and then give it to the entire world. And, there's a lot of people who feel that it's not reasonable to expect industry to take on all of the risk in that situation. So what we saw during COVID is, we have some countries like the US where we have sort of a very unique system where we provide immunity to companies and everyone sort of involved. Most other countries do not do that, but some will provide indemnification or other types of protection to companies. And then there's a few who just don't want to do this at all. But
1 more minute,
regardless
please.
of, sorry?
1 more minute, please.
Okay, regardless of how you feel about it, it caused delays. And we had weeks and even months of delays for some countries because they had to go negotiate these agreements with industry, and they had to to figure out what to do. And so we're asking for countries to prepare for this situation. And just a few other things to mention, in terms of just access, I mentioned procurement. We're talking about things like putting provisions in your procurement agreements. This is more for high-income countries, but really any country that has the capacity to procure early on. How do you use your procurement power to improve global access? Do you maybe put some provisions in your procurement agreement that require licensing or otherwise incentivize it, that encourage things like putting together global access plans for your product, but even governments needing to make sure that the contracts are written so that they can donate their product when they're ready, or they can modify their delivery schedule. These are things the United States did during COVID, but they weren't things that we were ready to do when we first signed our contracts. We actually had to go back and rewrite the contracts, which took time. So again, it's about saving time and looking for these efficiencies. And then finally, I will just mention, in terms of donation, we've got a great provision in the agreement about standards for sharing products, because we do not want people donating products that are about to expire in small amounts that can't be used well. Again, all based on our experience during COVID. How can we commit to higher standards for sharing products? And finally, the government set-asides. This is something that a lot of developed countries have supported, and the US in particular, that when you procure a product, you will set aside a certain amount of that product for use in countries at high risk and with public health need. And so these are all the different ways that I think governments in this agreement are committing to help improve access to life-saving products during a pandemic. Again, in large part based on what we saw during COVID, the things that we thought did not go as well as we would have liked. That's it. Thanks so much. Appreciate any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to hear about all the different angles that you take on access to medicines in the court negotiations. As a next speaker, I would like to ask Mrs. Astrid Dunselman from the Netherlands. Astrid, if you're there, please unmute yourself and also introduce yourself. And I hope you can share with us the insights from your perspective on access to medicines and the pandemic court negotiations.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation. So my name is Astrid Dunselman. I am the health attaché at the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands. So I am working for the Ministry of Health. I used to work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the diplomatic corps, and moved to the MOH to work in global health. And arrived 1st of March 2020. So that was, in many ways, interesting timing. Just to the Netherlands, to give an idea, the Netherlands has been from the start involved in this project. We are co-signatories of the op-ed in March 2021 that launched. That was the first start of the idea of having a pandemic treaty. We called it then, and worked together with a group of friends of the treaty towards the special session of WHA that launched the INB process. We are a supporter and really believe in the need for equity and to create a better prepared world in dealing with pandemics, and have a better response plan, which also then links to prevention. And of course, we are very committed to also have prevention of outbreaks of diseases. But when we set off this, when we started this process, we set the world together, and there's a need for equity. And I don't think everybody was sure or was in agreement of what that meant. What is equity in this context? And we've traveled the road together to figure out what that looks like. I think, as Jeff said, the clearest example of that in the text is Article 12, is PABS, the Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System, and that is something that we never had thought of before when we started on this journey, and that is a credit to the Africa Group also to introduce that idea in the negotiations. And as an EU, we were not immediately on board. The EU is, of course, negotiating on our behalf. We negotiate our position within the EU, and then the EU negotiating team takes that forward. But eventually, we actually also embraced the PABS as a proposal to create that equitable access that we need. Our experts of the National Institute of Public Health and Environment, we have actually one expert who is has a PhD in this topic, so she's very much involved in trying to create a system that works and that, for us, very important, keeps the free flow of data for research and science, but also creates the equity in access to benefits and to medical countermeasures. Of course, also a big part of that is what was also mentioned, improving the ecosystem for local production and distribution. Tech transfer is being mentioned in the chat. I already saw that is, of course, very important if we want to ensure surge capacity for production. And also there, I think the treaty as we are, or the accord as we are negotiating it, is a part of that puzzle and that solution. And then at the same time, there is a lot that we also will need to do in not in the legal sense of the work in the global health architecture, and in supporting member states and WHO support member states in creating an ecosystem that will create more possibilities for access. I thought what would be a nice addition maybe to the discussion is to, since we were there at the beginning, there were a few things unexpected. I think now, if you look back in where we are in 3 years, in 3 years, if we take March 2021 as the starting point of the idea, and I think what wasn't clear when we started in 2021, or what we could not have known, of course, is the political direction that we see now coming off the back of this, of the pandemic, maybe even, and especially in Europe, you see really a shift in trust in government, in how and trust in multilateralism, in WHO, a lot of mistrust and disinformation and misinformation there, but also, so that is affecting our politics and our governments, but also it's affecting our relations between member states. We see it in the CSO community, that there is also a lot of mistrust in the positioning that member states have, and how these are interpreted. And then, of course, within our societies, as I just mentioned, in what this accord might bring to us as member states. And I think that is a shame, and it is really impacting the speed with which we can move forward in coming to an agreement. And at the same time, that speed is exactly what we need if we want to use the political momentum and the memory that we have of the pandemic, and use that momentum to actually come to an agreement, which it is clear now what we can say will be the foundation actually of an agreement. As you will have seen in the text, there is not too much concrete that we can agree on now, and yet it is still a very valuable first step that I hope we can take in the WHA to mark a first milestone, and then in understanding that further work is necessary. And I think coming back to the move or the directions that member states, that the politics in many member states have made, including our own, is that we really have to look and be clear in what our needs are as member states in order to get a text that is ratifiable, and that we make sure that everybody can develop a good line of reasoning on why actually to enter into an agreement, because an agreement that is agreed but not ratified will not change a whole lot. And so that is a give and take process that we really still need to finalize, and we have 3.5 days left. And I hope that that we can come together in those 3.5 days, and if not, then also I want to say no harm done, and mainly because treaties and agreements, international agreements, are not developed in this short amount of time. Usually they take a lot of time. We have to have a good accord. Everybody has to be on board. So if we need more time, then I agree also with Jeff that we should harness the momentum that we have in order to create a path forward, as long as we are clear in what direction that text is going to take, and at least have an agreement there. And in that sense, I am definitely not pessimistic. I think we can we have a clear idea now of what we want as a first step. I leave it at that, because my door is also opening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Astrid Dunselman from the Netherlands. Indeed, very interesting to hear. Also, as well as we're following the debates that are ongoing in the Dutch Parliament about the pandemic accord, so we know exactly what the sense is over there. As a final speaker of the country representatives, I would like to ask Colombia, the Colombian health attaché, to step in and give her thoughts on the developments in the pandemic accord and access to medicines. Ms. Juliana Tenorio Quintero, health attaché from Colombia. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and apologies for the background noise. I'm actually in the cafeteria of WHO. So thank you so much first to the organizers for the invitation, especially you coming from like a civil society organized, like in giving us the opportunity to speak on this important issue. So we really appreciate that. And second, I will say the same thing that Emily said, and in terms of a disclaimer, if I may, and this is just my personal opinions. It won't reflect the position of my government, even though we are gonna discuss some of the issues that we have been discussing here during the negotiations of the pandemic treaty. And yes, apologies for my long name. I'm Colombian, so in Latin America we have 2 first names, 2 last names, so it's very hard to say the whole thing. I'm a diplomat as a background, so I'm not a health expert. I'm a lawyer, and I have been working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for almost 20 years. So I have been posted here in Geneva not so long ago as Astrid or Jeff, but I have been negotiating the pandemic agreement for about a year and a half. And I come from negotiations, in other processes. And so, first of all, it's really nice to see that I'm joined here in a panel with Astrid, of course, and especially with Jeff and Emily, because we have been dealing with these conversations on and off in the negotiations, in the plenary, in the auditorium, and of course in many bilaterals. So I had the pleasure to first join the first group of co-facilitators with Jeff, and in Article 11, and so I think we all share the same experience of having to have double hats, like representing our governments, but also trying to come up with solutions in terms of Articles 10 and 11, or original 11, on how the transfer of technology could have a really meaningful impact on the access to medicines, to vaccines, to diagnostics, to therapeutics, and especially in terms of pandemics. So, well, I think many things that I was going to share have already shared by my colleagues, which is nice because we usually see each other every day from sunset to dawn, from sunrise to dawn. So what I would like to share here is just a perspective of for developing country, for a Latin American country, and how it's like the challenges that a small delegation has in order to present their own positions here in the negotiation, and in a setting that is quite difficult in terms of having overlapping discussions, because we have HR and also IMB, and something that you already know. And in a process that we set ourselves a deadline that it was very tight, but it responded to the urgency of having this need of providing legal tools of how to respond, how to properly respond whenever the next pandemic will hit us. So you have also heard, especially from Astrid, on the issue of PAPs. So I'm not going to discuss PAPs, of course, but just to try to show you that for a small delegation, it was very hard to focus on many issues. So as Colombia, and again, just my personal opinion, just trying to convey to you how we selected to try to have a stronger voice in this issue of transfer of technology. We saw that there were different issues in the pandemic agreement, but we decided to try to concentrate on articles that could also operationalize equity besides PAPs. And why do I say PAPs? Because of course PAPs is the heart of the instrument, and it's the focus of many developing countries and delegations. But we also saw that we can rely on the efforts of our colleagues in the Group for Equity. Colombia is part of the Group for Equity in defending our position in that part. And we also saw that, seeing that small delegations struggle to cover every related item in the pandemic agreement, that perhaps it would be better to burden share the other issues in the instrument. And that's the reason why we decided that one of the most important issues will get us to have an impact in terms of equitable access would be the issue of transfer of technology, which is also a very difficult issue, because we have seen this in other multilateral negotiations, how this issue has been developed and evolved. So we decided to do that, and also in coordination with what we're doing and perhaps with our efforts in WTO. So we're trying to have the same message across the different forums and different scenarios, especially here in Geneva, trying to convey the message that we need to revise our position in terms of how to have an equitable system in terms of health, and that it could give us meaningful impacts in terms of access. So we did that, and we did it just trying to portray a message that we can talk about this in a scenario like WHO, because at the beginning, and it's still there's hesitancy from other delegations that says that WHO is not the place to discuss this, because obviously the transfer of technology article that we're discussing has an impact into other regimes. But we started the conversation, and we said that we needed to build a strong position and a base position without disregarding the old regimes, without disregarding the treaties that deals with the protection of intellectual property and so on, but just also utilizing those regimes in order to have meaningful impact in health, and especially in pandemics or during public health emergencies. That is very hard to do, and it's a conversation that is that you don't do overnight. So it's an effort that you do over the months. And I have to say here that, and Emily would, I hope Emily would agree with me, that we engage here with this conversation like since last year, and we have actually seen that the process is moving forward. So right now, what you see in Article 11, because I think the proposal by the Bureau is public by now because it had been leaked somewhere in the internet. So you all know the current status of Article 11, which of course deserves some other considerations, some edits, some adjustments, which of course you will say that we will still need more, and then we need some measures going forward. But in our perspective, what we see is just the basing, the setting stones of what we can do afterwards. That is not the complete change of the status quo, but it's just moving forward. We couldn't accept anything that could take us back in terms of what we already have in terms of transfer of technology. We see that there are some movements in terms of having like meaningful commitments in terms of licensing, in terms of having perhaps a multilateral mechanism that can provide us with pools, for example, of having this sharing of technologies, that we can also have a re-emphasizing of the trip flexibilities, and other things that you see now in what is current Article 11. And those
Can you round up?
And those we think are like baby steps in moving in the right direction, and we will continue to do so in other scenarios. And just as the final sentence, perhaps this could be seen as a framework convention. We don't disagree with that, or personally, I wouldn't disagree with that approach. This has been a very difficult negotiation. So if it's going to be a framework convention, like we need to set the base straight in order for us to continue working on this issue. And that's it from my side.
Thank you very much, Maria Juliana Tenorio Quintero. That was really interesting also to hear from your perspective from the Colombian side. I would like to move on to the next part where the civil society organizations get a chance to respond to the different member states' statements. So I would like to start with James Love of Knowledge Ecology International. James, you have the floor. Please introduce yourself and give your response to the presentations before.
Thank you, Ellen, and really congratulations on getting many of the most important negotiators on the treaty on the call. I think just a second here. My neighbor's got the webcast on here, so I'm trying to persuade him to mute it. So one thing is, if you go back a couple of years ago, like particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, and you hear heads of state, they were all talking about how they wanted there to be solidarity and no one's safe until everyone's safe, and we're all going to look at this as a global, as a global crisis, and there's talk about global public goods and things like that. And then later on, you had this very bitter negotiation at the WTO on the TRIPS waiver on an intellectual property thing, which really was a much different conversation than everyone's in it together. It was very much a fight over intellectual property rights, often not really grounded in the actual proposal, but really displaying much more of the ideological differences that people have on that issue. And then we get here at WHO. This is where health ministers are supposed to be like running the show, and where historically there's been more favorable to health conversations here than there have been in some other places in Geneva. And the negotiations have been, I mean, they're serious. The people here, you heard from some of the negotiators, you heard from Emily from the United States, you heard from Julia from Colombia and Philippines and the Netherlands. And I think all of the people that you've listened to, and I think the other people in the room, for the most part, are really trying to get an agreement within the constraints of the national instructions they have from their higher ups. Now, what's going on here, though, is a practical matter, is that the trade people and foreign service parts of the government are playing a pretty significant role in the negotiations. And particularly for the European Commission and the United States government, Japan, Switzerland, and the UK, I mean, it's very much a commitment to protect domestic industry. And you really see that playing out here. So on the equity front, there are these concerns about things like technology transfer, and there were proposals early on to do quite a bit in that area, or the so-called peace clause on the intellectual property provisions, where countries would agree not to harass and punish countries that tried to use things like compulsory licensing. And those have been very, very difficult negotiations. And that has had the practical effect of coming up with kind of a weaker text in those areas. Some proposals disappear altogether, and others are really watered down. And it's put more emphasis on the pathogen benefit pathogen access and benefit sharing system, the PABs. That's a system where countries collaborate on sharing not only samples, but sequences of samples with researchers and companies in return for contracts where they agree to do things related to equity. And those terms are not really set yet. And it's a different, that also is a really difficult negotiation, as the other people have mentioned. And we have been unhappy with the fact that so much of the burden of equity falls on the PABs, because we want free access to pathogen information as fast as possible in a pandemic to speed the development of countermeasures and have better quality and more people and more competition for that. But if the high-income countries keep blocking the other provisions in the agreement, it just really, developing countries, I think, correctly sort of perceive they have more leverage with PABs than they have with some other parts of the agreement. People in the chat mentioned, would we been, has a lack of transparency in negotiation benefited or gone against the benefit of the WHO in terms of the trust? And I'd have to say it's unfortunate. Across the street, there's a treaty negotiation at the World Intellectual Property Organization where it's pretty easy to get into the building. I mean, it's fairly easy to get, on a delegation over there. The people in the room can listen in on the informals, even the text-based informals. Quite a few of them are, you can actually watch it if you're in the room. You're not supposed to report it to everyone, but you can see quite a bit. And the plenaries are webcast, and things go on in the plenary. And it's just more transparent in the World Health Organization. And I think that's just part of the DNA of the World Health Organization. Really hasn't accepted the fact that they need to be more transparent, and they shouldn't be less transparent than the World Intellectual property organization is. And I know you have kind of strict time limits on me, so you may have to rein me in here pretty soon. But one thing that I would say to people that it struck me recently is that a lot of chapters are kind of vague and weak right now on the equity side, or on some of the, even the responsibilities countries have to do things that people all agree is a good idea, but they can't really fill in all the details here. But there are several chapters at the back of the agreement, one on amendments, one on annexes, and one on protocols, which provide a way, if the treaty ever comes into being, that it will be not the last word once the initial treaty goes in, because it will be possible going forward to adapt either amendments or annexes. I guess, as I understand it, annexes have the same legal effect as the text itself, but they can't change an article itself. Like, so you can amend an article, or you can have an annex to sort of set out what you do under the article, or you can add a protocol. And the protocols are particularly interesting because they can include countries which are not party to the treaty itself, as has been done in the Law of the Sea and some other UN treaties. So there's an architecture within the governance and the legal structure thing, and also on reservations, which makes it quite a bit flexible for countries to join or to participate if they don't join later on through the protocol mechanisms. And I thought that was something that I hadn't really paid too much attention to, but I thought that was kind of interesting. The thing, I'll just add one last thing. The thing I spent most of my time on, as people that follow our work know, is there's a lot of mentions on technology transfer that insert words like on mutually agreed upon terms. Sometimes that was completely eliminated from the text, but then it keeps coming back. And now you see the G7 countries trying to get voluntary mutually agreed terms. They keep trying to pile in all the voluntary stuff as much as they can in the text. And what we've been concerned about it is that it's a double standard threat here. And that is that the European Commission, as a regulation, a proposed regulation, it clearly says they can do mandatory measures on trade secrets, on materials, on know-how, on everything that's necessary to manufacture, if the voluntary measures are not adequate or if they're not available. And the US government has the same system, and the US used it extensively during COVID-19. And so when you ask the US or the EU, what's with all this mutually agreed upon terms and voluntary stuff in the agreement, when you yourself back home reserve the right to do whatever is necessary if there's an emergency? They say that they don't think that the agreement prevents them from doing it. They just think it promotes voluntary stuff. It doesn't really say you can't do non-voluntary stuff. And so we'd say, well, if that's true, you need to say that more plainly so it doesn't become a method of bullying countries on those obligations. And a good thing is that there is now a proposal from the United States and the UK and Brazil and Colombia in a parallel negotiation on a pretty similar point. And it looks like there may be some progress on that thing, and we're really keen to see that move forward. And I congratulate all four of those governments for what they've tried to do to reach what I think is a very useful proposal in that area. And I don't know where I am on time. I'm assuming I'm over time, so I'm gonna stop right now.
Thanks a lot, James. That's really interesting and good to hear these latest developments as well of this group of countries proposing. As next speaker, I would like to ask Mrs. Ellen Hoen from Medicines, Law and Policy to give a response to the previous speakers.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Ella. And well, first of all, congratulations on bringing such a very interesting panel together. It doesn't make my job any easier, because I think most of the points have already been made. But I'm taking the so my name is Ellen Hoen. I am the director of Medicines, Law and Policy, and we are a research and advocacy group, and we focus mostly on issues related to access to medicines and intellectual property, and in the context of COVID-19 and in the preparation for this for the negotiations of the pandemic agreement, we have mainly focused on the themes of sharing intellectual property, know-how, and technology towards a more equitable way of developing and supplying pandemic countermeasures. So with that lens, we have been looking at the negotiations. I'm going to take a prompt from Astrid, who mentioned the memory of COVID-19, because it's interesting to look back at what was identified as the lessons from COVID-19 that would need to inform or address in the pandemic agreement. And I would like to start with the first lesson, in my view, is public financing of research and development works. We've heard Emily talk about de-risking in relation to liability issues of the industry, but where the real de-risking had happened for COVID-19 vaccine was really in the cost of the R&D, which was largely carried by public financing and procurement commitments. But linked to that is the lesson that not attaching conditions to that financing was a huge missed opportunity. Another lesson is the lack of manufacturing capacity and that regionalized. Several speakers have mentioned that manufacturing capacity needs to be increased, but that would require also firm commitments towards technology transfer and the sharing of the know-how necessary to increase that capacity. And we've already heard that those are really the thorny issues, right, continue to be the thorny issues in the negotiations. There's a recognition in the text that TRIPS flexibilities are important. There's still not a willingness to clearly state that if countries use them, they will not be that can happen without consequences. But it is also important to acknowledge that there are limits to the usefulness of the TRIPS flexibilities, and in particular with regard to compulsory licensing, when it concerns more complex technologies such as biologics, and we've seen it with the mRNA vaccines, where just having access to the patents is not sufficient. You do need a mechanism for accessing the know-how. So again, this speaks to the technology transfer issue. And a crucial point, of course, is that leaving all powers in the hands of companies has huge limitations. I've been surprised throughout the negotiations, this focus on making everything voluntary, while a key lesson of COVID-19 was that this will to share the technology and to help expand manufacturing capacity elsewhere really was not there. Even commitments that companies in the end, after huge pressure made, such as Moderna's manufacturing capacity or manufacturing in sub-Saharan Africa has only recently been rolled back for the company without any consequences. Now, if voluntary measures exist, and there are exceptions, of course, we've seen it with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, where licenses were available and has helped to crank up fast, large-scale manufacturing. But where it does not exist, you need to have, as governments, and not only in the European Union and in the United States, the ability to have to take effective non-voluntary measures, including in the area of know-how. And we've published a number of commentaries on that subject. And if my colleagues are on the call, they could perhaps post some of those in the chat. We've been worried by at a certain point in the negotiations. We've been worried. Well, actually, we're still worried about that because we still don't know what the end result will be. But that the existing policy space in this area would actually be rolled back if you keep sprinkling the term voluntary throughout an agreement there's a real overkill of that term at the moment. You send a signal, you create in a way, you risk creating a new norm that is the way to go, even though in a lot of areas, countries, of course, can take non-voluntary measures when that is necessary. Again, if it's not necessary, you don't need them, but you need to have those measures in your back pocket when it is needed. And the second area is, and this is somewhat linked to that, the overuse of qualifiers in the text, where even meaningful provisions get toned down by qualifiers such as appropriate, or language that weakens those commitments. So I think we've gone a little bit from a more hopeful situation 2.5 years ago, when the decision was taken to start these negotiations, when there was a recognition that the equity issue really required new commitments that would change the status quo, to a situation where we're sort of protecting the status quo and perhaps have here and there some meaningful commitments. Now that is the more sort of dark view of it. My more positive side says it is important to conclude this agreement. It will also create a base and a process and political processes to, in the future, further improve it. I hope very much that will not be on the basis of the lessons of the next pandemic, because I actually think we should be doing a whole lot better. But the way also Juliana was talking about it, if you have the framework and you have some of the foundations, then you can also continue to build and further strengthen the instrument. And that's how I see the future, provided that you indeed conclude an agreement this time around. And with that, I have no idea what my time slot is, but with that, I'll hand back to you, Ella.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And I see your colleague Caitlin, she posted some of the resources in the chat for everyone to read, and interesting to hear about the voluntary provisions. As a final speaker today, I would like to ask Luis Villarroel to respond to the country representatives. Luis, please introduce yourself and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ella, and again, congratulations to you for putting this panel, and thank you to the members of government that are sharing with us their experience. And an introduction to myself, so you see where I come from. I'm a lawyer, and I have a background on intellectual property as being an IP advisor for the government of Chile. We participated in a number of free trade agreements, and also providing advice in the process of legal reforms in my country and in other Latin American countries. And also, I've been a judge in the Industrial Property Court of Chile. And now I'm director of an NGO that's working on IP issues related to access to knowledge and innovation. So I will give, two observations, general, and then I will focus on what is my field, which is IP. So my first general observation, and I think hasn't been commented so far, is the lack of balance that we see in the negotiation power or capabilities of member countries. Where we see that some delegations are able to have large team with experts from different topics, including trade, and we see others that are just one or two person that cannot even attend to all meetings because of the number of persons that are based in Geneva. So that is something that really affects the legitimacy of the negotiations when we see this type of uneven situation. And especially this is worsened because of the lack of transparency on the negotiation, because normally, a smaller negotiation rely more on stakeholders, to get more inputs and advice that they are not able to find anywhere. So we have small teams and also lack of transparency. That is something that really affects, the outcome and the balanced outcome. Also, I would like to highlight that one of the lessons that we have learned from the past COVID pandemics, and that I think hasn't been, also mentioned, is that that we saw that some industries can abuse the power that they have, and we need to make sure that there are solutions to control those abuses. Two examples, we of the type of abuses I'm thinking. For example, we have the case of Roche that they refused to provide information to make a solution needed for the COVID test, and it was needed to have some heavy action from EU Commission and the Netherlands, and to get that information to make work the COVID test kit that was used in Netherlands. But also this happened in the same situation in Chile, and so we didn't have that same level of response to get Roche to act. Also, we saw other type of abuses. For example, in Chile, it was discovered that the two major oxygen producers had colluded, to corner the market and affect the distribution, and of course to get the higher prices during the pandemic, where oxygen was really needed. So we are concerned that there's been a lot of on thinking on how to limit liability for industry, but not including as well some measures to make sure, or tools that will prevent that type of abuses, especially those related to antitrust. But as I said, my comment will focus on IP, where I have more experience, and IP is particularly important to address a next pandemic with success, and I see that the preamble of the proposed text as referring to IP it fell short. According to the preamble, it highlights the importance of IP for development of new drugs, and make the caveat that can affect prices. But in fact, IP cannot. Does affect more than prices. It's also affect the availability of the drug. When there is not all who can produce are producing the drug, and affecting technology transfer and follow-up innovation. So we saw for the case of vaccines, and the well-known Moderna case, where IP could have hindered the development of a new vaccine unless IP flexibilities were applied as it was in the case of the United States. So in this context, to make sure that the national law are in shape to address IP barriers through flexibilities, and to include obligations, as mentioned by Ellen, to link public funding to the need to provide access, and incentives for voluntary licensing is critical to have a timely response. And in this aspect, it still seems that the text is very vague and weak. So sometimes, talking with negotiators of the developing countries, they ask me, why, will you need a provision that mandates that are the national law are updated, and the answer is because and I know from experience of trying to push a law reform in Chile to include government use, is that the industry pressures are very strong, and they're able to sometimes to delay, as has been the case in Chile for many years, those reforms. And these reforms are very needed because the experience in Latin American countries I would say, for example, in the case of Peru, the national law are really a nightmare if you want to provide a compulsory licensing, even in the context of pandemic. In the case of Peru, interestingly, to have issue a compulsory licensing, it has to have the signature not only of the Ministry of Health, but all the ministers of the cabinet. So that makes completely in practical terms to issue a compulsory licensing. Even in the context of COVID, for example, it was tried to push the Paxlovid compulsory licensing, and that was not possible. Also, not only national law are not good enough, but also some regional laws. For example, in the Andes Pact, because of the interpretation of the Andes Community IP law, the court, the Andes court, forced Ecuador to put down compulsory licensing that they have made for raltegravir, a drug for HIV, because it didn't, comply with an absurd number of requirements of details with regard to the patented product, and which was not available at the time that the license was done. Or in Chile, to get a compulsory license for hepatitis C, it was like 1 year it took to make a decision whether it was needed or not. So we need definitely to update the laws and looking in the model that has United States or Europe, but that is not possible in practice unless we have a mandate to do so in the treaty, because otherwise the pressures from industry and sometimes bilateral pressures that they impede to this happening. So it's critical to have the mandate, and of course the peace clause in Article 11, who will give some standing to and tranquility of mind those pushing for these reforms.
Can you round up, Luis?
Yes, I can finish in a second. So and finally, there are other gaps that need to be pushed through the instrument as regard to licensing that is not treats flexibility. For example, in most Latin American countries, including Chile, they don't have a margin rights. They are not provision linking funding to conditions of access. So it's very critical to include those in the instrument. And because of the time, I will finish here, and thank you for your work, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Luis. It's really interesting to hear more about the different perspectives of Latin American countries and to hear more about your expertise on intellectual property. We have 10 more minutes. If there are questions, you can put them in the chat. I already saw some really interesting comments coming by, and there was one question I thought could be interesting to ask, at least to Astrid Dunselman and perhaps also other panelists. I saw James Love already responding in the chat, but Astrid, if you're still there, could you answer the question, do you think the level of trust in the treaty negotiation process would have been higher or lower if NGOs, experts and the media had been admitted to the negotiation process rather than excluded? The question was posed by Bill Jeffrey.
Hi, yes, I'm here. Very good question. To be honest, I had this discussion a few weeks ago, I think, with Ellen, because I wasn't that aware of the practices in other fora where the interaction with non-state actors or civil society organizations is way more direct. I think the hesitancy is a bit of a tradition of WHO that is also recognized as a problem for the CSO community. And this is why we have a framework of engagement for NSA, so that we can create more comfort for WHO to engage with non-state actors and not being accused of inappropriate interventions or interactions in terms of norm setting and research. But this is, of course, other process. This is not, it's a member state negotiation and not a scientific development of a program. So there it might be, yes, it might have been better to completely open up. And at the same time, I have zero time for anything. So I haven't had time to check with my colleagues what their experiences are in having that open interaction and those more open negotiations, because I can also imagine that, especially on the very high strung issues and that are so political or polarized, and because there are so many issues in this accord that we can only see further polarization happening in also the reflections of non-state actors, and kind of fueling that when we are in the briefings together, you can see more of, grandstanding and positioning. Would that doesn't create more comfort with member states to actually think, okay, yeah, let's open the doors, because we see that the reflex so far has been that when the doors are opened, but maybe it's because they are not so often open, we see that the reflexes of member states is also to go back to their original positions and be very strong and strict and polarized and politicized, whereas with behind closed doors you have a different kind of conversation. So this is a very long answer, I'm sorry. The point I'm trying to also make is, so I don't know, I think we really have to consider then, I want to know from colleagues how it changes the dynamic. Does it create a dynamic of, let's have an open and frank discussion? Yes, that would be great. If it is only fueling the grandstanding that we've seen so far, when there is an open debate, it won't help much. And what I want to ask my colleagues who are working in or with organizations where there is a more open interaction is, okay, so where do then, are there, for instance, way more behind closed doors informal negotiations? Because I also know from experience that not everything can be said when everybody is in the room. So how does that work? What dynamic creates that as well?
Could I respond a bit about the WIPO experience? Because I have
Thank you,
quite a bit of
Astrid. Yes,
experience.
please go ahead, James.
Yeah, I mean, Louise and I, in particular, have had a lot of experience with the WIPO thing, but of course, not all the discussions are in a transparent way. Some of them are, the bilaterals, or they have some that are coordinators. There's some stuff that's just not public, but quite a bit is public. And one thing they've introduced a few years back in WIPO is they'll have what they call an informal. It'll be in a different room than everyone's in. Now, you're like the people like us, the drug companies, the publishers, the civil society, all the hippies. We're all sort of sitting together in this big room, along with all the government reps that can't get into the informal, right? Because they usually have a limited number of people that can go in there. But in the informal things, they'll have a PowerPoint with the screen, a word processing thing where they do the text, and they actually do the textual suggestions and negotiations. And we get to listen in and watch what they do. And what they do is they tell us that it's not Chatham House rules. We're just not allowed to tweet about it or put it in social media. But everyone is like using WhatsApp, and they're sending emails, and they're meeting with people in coffee breaks, and they're talking about what's going on, because we know what's going on. And we're obviously communicating through our networks. Like the drug companies and the publishers are certainly telling their clients, what's going on and who's doing what. So all the interested parties have pretty much complete transparency about what's happening, as long as you can have someone in the room. And we thought that's not transparent enough, because we want Chatham House rules, so you can talk about what's being said as long as you don't say who says it. Now, the problem you got now is that social media is just going crazy about the WHO and the pandemic. And they're accusing this thing of just all kinds of insane conspiracies all the time. And that's getting back to politicians, heads of states, ministers, newspapers. You know, you have 49 U.S. senators oppose anything to do with the treaty. And they obviously don't even know what's in the agreement. And so what you've done is you've sort of given the microphone to like RFK Jr. and people like that, because they've become like a source of information about what's going on here, even though it's a complete crock of shit what they're saying. So I think it's dangerous to have a lack of transparency in an era of social media.
Great. Thank you very much. Ellen, you wanted to respond to this as well, or something else?
Well, James made most of the points that I tried to make, but perhaps just to recall that I think we've had one session where we were in the room with the negotiators, and that was a very I found a very good and very rich exchange, and a huge added value of that session was that it had industry representatives, NGOs, all kinds of other organizations, and I think that was actually very helpful to have that conversation. And I really want to echo what Jamie said. The greater transparency will only help to squash the vast amount of misinformation that is out there, because people can just make up what's happening here, and it's hard to combat it, because no one really has a good peek into the room. Over.
Thank you very much, Luis.
Yes, no, just a quick add. I have been a negotiator myself, representing Ecuador or Chile, and particularly in the negotiation of intellectual property in WIPO. And it's wonderful when you go outside the room and you talk with the civil society or the stakeholders, that they know what is going on, because then I can have immediate input that is appropriated. So definitely I think that it will be much more useful for government officials negotiating if they have an informed civil society. That's it.
Thank you very much. I am afraid we get to the end of our panel, unless there is, are there other country representatives that want to respond, to give a final comment?
Jeff had his hand up. I'd like to know what
Jeff,
thinks.
do you want to say something still?
No, just I wanted to speak on that element of transparency and NSA participation. I've been in multilateral forums that have very strong participation by CSOs. A close example would be the FCTC COPs. And I understand that in the early 2000s, when the FCTC was being negotiated, there was very strong participation by civil society groups. The main difference between the FCTC and the pandemic treaty is that there's no one single direction in the pandemic treaty, whereas in the FCTC, all civil society groups there are in favor of tobacco control and reduction of use. If you look at the main contentious issues of the pandemic treaty, and these are in the operationalization of equity, it has a decidedly north-south dynamic. And if you look at the distribution of CSOs working on these issues, overwhelming majority would take on positions supportive of developing member states. You will have quite a number of CSOs that will take positions that would be in support, for example, of increased surveillance and One Health, but the overwhelming majority would be in support of developing member state positions, including many of the CSOs represented here. So whether their presence would lead to greater trust, that would be very difficult to say. But the impact it would have on how member states present their position would be very, very interesting. And I'm assuming it would make the work of developing member states quite a bit easier if there were more transparency. Thank you.
with that remark, I would like to finish today's session. I think we can keep on talking on many more topics that were in the chat as well, on the voluntariness of the accord, etc. But unfortunately, we said to each other we will stick to 1.5 hours, and it's been a great honor to have so many interesting people here present today in this panel. People from the US, the Netherlands, the Philippines, Colombia, and of course my colleagues from different civil society organizations. Unfortunately, Mrs. Precious Matsoso, the IMB co-chair, was not here today, but it didn't matter. We still had a very interesting discussion with each other. And I would like to thank all the panel members for their contribution to this discussion. And I wish you all the best of luck in the coming days and weeks still. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, Ella.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.